The night the Japanese Navy realized that steel, discipline, and naval tradition meant absolutely nothing against American underwater engineering was the night the ocean itself turned into a graveyard. No warnings, no second chances. One moment, the destroyer Harusame cut through the Pacific with confidence. The next, it was trapped in a kill box forged by a single American submarine that hunted like a ghost and killed like a machine built by a nation that refused to lose. The USS Harder didn't just fire torpedoes, it delivered underwater verdicts. Mark 18 electric torpedoes, 21 inches wide, nearly 3,000 pounds each, slid silently beneath the waves, invisible, unstoppable, guided by American precision. And when they hit, they didn't explode ships, they erased them. Hulls didn't sink, they folded. Crews didn't fight, they vanished. Commanders didn't retreat, they stared into nothing and understood the Pacific was no longer theirs. What happened next wasn't a battle, it was annihilation. Before we dive into the chain reaction of destruction that turned the USS Harder into Japan's worst nautical nightmare, I need something from you. Tell me where in America you're watching this from. Are you in Texas, sipping coffee while imagining torpedoes tearing destroyers apart? Are you in California, headphones on, picturing submarines stalking targets in the dark? Maybe you're in Florida, New York, Illinois, or stationed somewhere overseas, serving right now. Drop your city in the comments. I actually want to know who's here, real patriots consuming real history. And while you're down there, hit that like button if the idea of one submarine rewriting naval warfare gives you chills. Let the platform know that stories like this, stories about American engineering, American strategy, and American dominance, deserve to be pushed to the world. If you're not subscribed yet, why? You're about to witness a naval engagement so ruthless, Japan never recovered from its psychological impact. Buckle up. What comes next is war without mercy. The Pacific in mid-1944 wasn't just ocean and waves, it was a pressure cooker ready to explode. Japan's Imperial Navy had spent years cultivating the myth of invincibility. Disciplined destroyer crews, seasoned officers, and ships crafted with meticulous naval pride. They believed their tactics, honed through decades of warfare and refined by victories across Asia, were enough to keep the United States at bay. But they were prepared for yesterday's enemy. What they were not prepared for was an American submarine that didn't fight like a submarine. The USS Harder fought like a predator engineered in a laboratory of vengeance. Commissioned on December 2, 1942, the USS Harder was a Gato-class submarine, stretching 301 feet from bow to stern, powered by 4 diesel engines that could push her submerged at over 20 knots when needed. Inside her hull lived not just sailors, but hunters, men trained to stalk and eliminate steel targets thousands of tons heavier than themselves. Her captain, Commander Samuel D. Dealey, wasn't interested in skirmishes. He wanted trophies. He wanted to carve his name into the spine of the Japanese Navy. The Mark 18 torpedoes loaded inside Harder's belly were nothing like the faulty torpedoes that had humiliated earlier American subs. These were the first mass-produced electric torpedoes in U.S. Navy service, silent, wakeless, unfathomably terrifying to anyone on the receiving end. Each Mark 18 weighed nearly 3,000 pounds, measured 21 inches in diameter, and carried a warhead packed with over 500 pounds of explosive filler capable of ripping open a steel hull like paper soaked in gasoline. They didn't announce themselves with bubbles or trails. They appeared only once, at the moment of detonation. Japan, confident in its destroyer screen tactics, believed submarines could be tracked, cornered, and crushed under depth charges. But the Harder was different. She didn't avoid combat, she provoked it. Instead of retreating from destroyers, Dealey hunted them. Harder's crew called it picking fights with wolves, but the results spoke louder than metaphors. The wolves kept dying. June 1944. The American submarines slipped into waters around the Philippines, territory the Japanese considered securely theirs. To them, destroyers like the Harusame were guardians of naval pride, bristling with depth charges, 25mm AA guns, and trained sonar operators. Their job was simple: drive American submarines out or drive them under. Then the Harder appeared. Sonar operators aboard Japanese vessels began reporting phantom contacts. Destroyer captains ordered evasive maneuvers. Depth charges hammered empty water columns. No one realized they were being played. Dealey wasn't escaping their patrols. He was mapping them. He was studying their rhythm, their arrogance, and the cracks in their belief that American subs feared them. Once Harder locked onto a destroyer, the attack was inevitable. The submarine didn't simply fire torpedoes, it set traps, approached from impossible angles, vanished beneath thermal layers, and exploited every weakness in Japan's naval doctrine. While Japanese crews scanned the surface for periscopes, Harder slid beneath them, silent as a rumor, deadly as a verdict. American naval intelligence later described Harder's engagement philosophy as offensive submarine warfare taken to irrational levels. But irrational doesn't matter when it works, and for Japan, it worked far too well. The stage was set. Harusame, a Shiratsuyu-class destroyer capable of 34 knots and armed to hunt subs, steamed confidently through familiar waters. Her crew trusted in depth charges, sonar sweeps, and doctrine that claimed Japanese destroyers were predators, not prey. They were wrong. The USS Harder didn't stalk Harusame, it sentenced her, and the ocean, as it would soon prove, was ready to hold the body. Before the Harusame ever knew it was being hunted, its fate was already sealed in Harder's firing solutions. The submarine lurked beneath a shifting thermal layer where seawater temperatures hid her acoustic signature from Japanese sonar. In naval warfare, invisibility isn't magic, it's physics, and Dealey understood physics better than the men trying to kill him. While the Harusame's operators trusted their equipment, Harder used the ocean itself as a cloak. The destroyer moved at a confident pace. Its captain believed submarines feared proximity. Doctrine taught him to force them deep, pressure them, and drown them in steel rain from depth charges. But Harder wasn't diving away. She was closing the distance. Dealey wanted the Harusame close enough that a single error would mean obliteration. The closer the target, the shorter the Mark 18's runtime, and the shorter the runtime, the smaller the chance of evasion. This was not a chase. It was a tightening noose. Harder surfaced periscope depth, just long enough for Dealey to confirm what sonar had already whispered. The Harusame was blind to its own funeral. Then came the command that would enter submarine legend. Fire 1. A Mark 18 slid from its tube, then a second, and then a third. No white wake, no trail, no warning. To the Japanese lookouts, the ocean remained calm, as if the sea itself had conspired to hide America's vengeance. Seconds stretched like minutes. Inside the Harusame's sound room, operators detected nothing, no cavitation, no signature, no reason to panic, until there was. The first torpedo struck just aft of the engine room, detonating beneath the keel. A hole the size of a truck erupted into existence, and seawater smashed into the destroyer with the force of a runaway freight train. Men were thrown against bulkheads, boilers ruptured, lights failed. What had been a weapon of war became a flooding coffin. The second torpedo didn't hit metal, it found chaos. It punched into wreckage already losing structural integrity, turning twisted steel into airborne shrapnel that sliced through men who'd never even seen their attacker. By the time the third torpedo arrived, the Harusame wasn't a ship, it was a scar. The impact ripped what remained of her midsection apart, like fabric held together by memory. The destroyer began sinking unevenly, bow lifting, stern disappearing, hull breaking into jagged sections. Survivors later reported the most disturbing detail: the silence. No roar of engines, no calls for course correction, no orders from the bridge, just water, steel, and inevitability. Harder didn't watch her victim die. She dove again, anticipating retaliation. Japanese destroyers nearby scrambled, convinced they could avenge their sister ship. They dropped depth charges with religious fury, believing persistence could kill ghosts. But the Harder wasn't running, it was repositioning. Minutes later she fired again, this time at the destroyer Tanikaze. Another hit, another explosion, another name erased from the Imperial Navy's roster. The Pacific wasn't a battleground anymore. It was a ledger, and Dealey was balancing it with torpedoes. Japanese officers began describing Harder not as a submarine, but as the underwater demon. In a navy steeped in ritual and honor, fear wasn't common. But fear was now undeniable. A single American submarine was undoing decades of doctrine and prestige with mechanical precision and absolute indifference. The Harusame's remains disappeared beneath the surface. No glorious last words, no heroic return, no final message, just bubbles and silence. And for the Japanese Navy, silence was worse than defeat. Silence meant something was hunting them that they could neither see nor understand. The shockwaves from Harusame's destruction didn't just sink steel, they sank illusions. Japan's naval command had built its confidence on a brutal equation. Destroyers overwhelm submarines, submarines avoid destroyers. The USS Harder shredded that logic like scrap paper tossed into a turbine. Reports arrived at headquarters describing torpedo detonations without wakes, impacts without warnings, and ships vanishing without a chance to retaliate. Officers dismissed the first report as exaggeration, the second as coincidence. After the third, no one laughed anymore. But what truly disturbed them wasn't the loss of ships, it was the pattern. Battleships die in fleets, carriers die in campaigns. But destroyers, agile, fast, built specifically to hunt submarines, were being erased one by a single adversary that refused to obey any known rule of naval engagement. Harder wasn't sinking ships. It was dismantling psychology. On board the submarine, the atmosphere wasn't triumphant, it was clinical. The crew operated in a narrow metal tube, less than 28 feet wide at its thickest point, surrounded by batteries that could flood the compartment with poisonous chlorine gas if seawater breached them. Every action had to be perfect. Every order had to be instant. Submarines don't forgive hesitation. Dealey walked among his men like a surgeon in a war hospital. Calm voice, steady tone, absolute conviction. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. Every crew member knew they were participating in something unprecedented. They weren't passengers. They were the scalpel. Harder's sonar and fire control teams had developed techniques bordering on supernatural. They tracked propeller beats, mapped destroyer evasions, predicted zigzag patterns, and fired into future positions, shooting where the enemy would be, not where it was. Japanese ships, unaware of this evolution, responded like prey caught in a trap they didn't realize was closing. Word spread across the Imperial Navy like a rumor no one wanted to believe. Destroyer captains reported periscopes appearing at impossible angles. Depth charge runs yielded no oil slicks, no debris, no proof of victory. Just a sensation that something was waiting for them, watching, smiling from the abyss. Some officers demanded new tactics, others demanded courage. But the problem wasn't tactical or emotional. It was existential. Japan had built its wartime identity on offense. Harder turned their strengths against them. Every time a destroyer accelerated to charge, it provided a cleaner firing solution. Every time sonar operators scanned forward, Harder slid beneath them. Every defensive action became self-sabotage. And Dealey understood this with chilling clarity. He once described destroyers as animals trained to hunt lions, unaware they'd entered a cage. The Pacific was his cage, and every ship that entered was already dead. It just didn't know when. By the third destroyer kill, Japanese communications adopted a new tone: panic. Ships rerouted, convoys deviated, escorts doubled back. The Imperial Navy began fighting shadows, torpedoes, and time. Their destroyers once symbolized dominance. Now they symbolized vulnerability. Victory doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it waits. Sometimes it surfaces, fires, and disappears before comprehension catches up. But the most terrifying truth was still undiscovered. Japan believed Harder's success was luck, geography, or temporary advantage. They didn't know this was just the beginning, that the submarine had not yet reached the moment where history would no longer record numbers, but consequences. Destroyers could be replaced. Pride could not. And soon, the USS Harder wasn't just sinking ships, it was dismantling an empire's confidence, one torpedo at a time. By late June, the waters around Tawi-Tawi had transformed into the most dangerous hunting ground in the Pacific, and every Japanese vessel that entered it did so with the same silent dread. The Harder might be here. Naval war diaries later revealed officers performing pre-combat rituals, whispering superstitious phrases, and tapping steel bulkheads before battle, behaviors unheard of in the rigid structure of the Imperial Navy. Destroyers were no longer aggressive guardians of the Empire. They were men with haunted eyes, waiting for a sound they couldn't hear and a death they couldn't fight. The Harder had become more than a submarine. It was a psychological weapon. Dealey understood something fundamental. Warfare isn't won only by destroying machines. It's won by destroying certainty. And certainty was the first casualty of the Harusame engagement. Once that ship disappeared without a trace, no Japanese commander could trust his senses again. Radar could lie. Sonar could fail. Doctrine could betray. The only truth was fear. Fear makes men hesitate. Hesitation creates openings. Openings get ships killed. As convoys pushed south through the Sibutu Passage, Harder positioned herself like a wolf waiting along a migration route. Japanese formations zigzagged, changed speeds, and deployed depth-charge screens in patterns that looked impressive. But Harder didn't care about patterns. Dealey cared about timing. He waited for ships to expose their weakest points during course changes. He waited for confusion. He waited for ego. The Tanikaze made that mistake. Believing his destroyer could force Harder into a defensive posture, Tanikaze's captain ordered an aggressive charge toward a sonar contact he assumed was off balance. What he didn't know was that Harder had baited that reading. Dealey had purposely surfaced just long enough to lure the destroyer into closing distance before diving and plotting a perfect intercept. When the Tanikaze accelerated, she effectively lined herself up like a clay pigeon. Dealey didn't need luck, just geometry. He fired a spread of torpedoes into the destroyer's projected path. The result wasn't a naval battle. It was a mathematical execution. Witnesses described the impact as a moment where time split in half. 1 second, Tanikaze existed. The next, she didn't. The detonation didn't merely breach her hull. It drove explosive gases through compartments with such violent overpressure that steel buckled inward. Men were shredded before they had time to scream. Sections of the ship separated like broken vertebrae, sending debris skyward in a grotesque fountain of metal and uniforms. The ocean swallowed what remained. In Tokyo, naval strategists tried to rationalize the losses. Some blamed weak sonar, others blamed poor training. A few whispered the unthinkable, that the Americans had developed a weapon system capable of striking without physics. The truth was simpler and far more humiliating. Harder had turned the Imperial Navy's most reliable asset, the destroyer, into a liability. Once the cornerstone of Japanese anti-submarine warfare, destroyers now painted targets on their own hulls every time they moved. Harder was rewriting naval doctrine in real time, and Japan didn't have the luxury of denial anymore. Destroyer captains refused patrol assignments. Crews muttered about curses, and somewhere beneath them, in silence and steel, Dealey prepared the next shot. History remembers large explosions, iconic battles, and mountain-sized aircraft carriers. But sometimes history pivots because one man decides to aim where no one expects. The ocean was about to learn what happened when that decision scaled. By early July, Japanese officers no longer asked if the Harder was in their waters. They asked where and how soon it would strike again. Naval radio transmissions became tense fragments of paranoia. Destroyer captains demanding new escort vessels, sonar operators insisting on phantom contacts, convoy commanders begging for air support. Every splash, every shadow, every flicker on a radar screen became a potential precursor to death. The Harder had achieved what most weapon systems never do. It lived rent-free in the minds of its enemies, but fear alone didn't sink ships. Dealey made sure the next blow was tactical, not emotional. The USS Harder had tracked a convoy moving through the waters near Basilan Strait, oil tankers, ammunition carriers, and a cluster of destroyers acting as escort. The Japanese relied on predictable geometry, spacing their vessels at roughly 2,000-yard intervals to create a defensive net. On paper, it was smart. In the real world of submarine warfare, it was suicide. A net only works if the predator respects it. Harder didn't. Dealey studied the pattern, waited for the inevitable course correction near a sandbar, and positioned his submarine precisely where the convoy would funnel itself into a narrow channel. It was like watching a bull charge into a matador's cape, predictable, emotional, fatal. When the lead destroyer, the Harusame, made her turn, Dealey ordered Harder to periscope depth. The sea around them vibrated with engine noise, propeller beats, and the mechanical pulse of a navy unaware of its funeral procession. Torpedo tubes flooded, electrical switches armed. The fire control team entered firing solutions so quickly it seemed rehearsed. Fire 1! A single Mark 18 surged forward, followed by a second. Inside the destroyer, no alarms sounded. No operator detected anything. No officer had time to react. Torpedoes don't ask permission to change history. The first explosion snapped the Harasame's spine. Her hull bent grotesquely, bulkheads rupturing like overpressurized boilers. The second torpedo punched into her magazines, igniting ammunition that detonated in a volcanic plume of steel and flame. The destroyer flipped, bow lifting as its stern sank fast enough to drag sailors, weapons, and compartments into a watery vortex. But Dealey wasn't satisfied. He wasn't hunting ships, he was hunting reactions. As surviving escorts accelerated toward the blast site, Harder dove, rotated, and fired again. 2 more torpedoes launched into paths Japanese captains hadn't even predicted. The radar picket destroyer Minatsuki rushed to assist, unaware she was sprinting into her own execution. One torpedo struck beneath her forward turret, blowing it skyward in a plume of metal, oil, and bone. Sailors who were alive 10 seconds earlier now rained back into the ocean in pieces. Japanese command had lost 3 destroyers in days. Doctrine didn't explain it. Training didn't prevent it. Pride couldn't ignore it. Harder had broken something far more valuable than ships. It broke momentum. War isn't just explosions and statistics. War is flow. Confidence creates speed. Fear slows it. Japan, once a tidal wave, now moved like a wounded animal, dangerous yet predictable, bleeding strength with every attempt to defend itself. By the end of the Harder's 5th kill, Imperial Navy commanders faced a terrifying reality. A single American submarine was collapsing an entire segment of Japan's naval strategy. Destroyers no longer projected power. They attracted torpedoes, and the Pacific had begun whispering a truth no admiral wanted to hear. No one hunts the Harder. The Harder hunts you. What came next would cement that whisper into a legend. By mid-July, Japan's naval leadership entered a stage no navy ever wants to reach: strategic denial. They couldn't accept the mathematical certainty staring them in the face. One American submarine was dismantling an entire doctrine built over decades. The Imperial Navy still possessed battleships, cruisers, and carriers, but without destroyer screens, they were blind giants. Ships built to intimidate now sailed with the same brittle confidence as glass statues in a room full of hammers. Harder was that hammer. Dealey knew the Japanese would eventually deploy their heaviest escort groups to neutralize his submarine. Instead of avoiding them, he prepared to confront them. The Harder repositioned near Dassault Bay, where Japanese reinforcements, two more destroyers, the Matsuo and Hayanami, were ordered to hunt the American threat. Tokyo believed concentration of force could overpower a single submarine. They still hadn't learned the lesson. Harder wasn't fighting surface warfare. Harder was rewriting it. As the destroyers advanced, sonar operators braced themselves for the familiar cat-and-mouse game, but the cat wasn't hiding. Harder rose to periscope depth, exposed herself deliberately, then vanished. It was a taunt. An insult so blatant that both Japanese captains committed the same mistake their predecessors had. They charged. Destroyers are terrifying when they attack submarines, unless they attack in straight lines. Straight lines are firing lanes. Dealey waited for Matsuo to accelerate, predicted her zigzag interval, and launched two Mark 18s into her approach vector. The torpedoes ran silent, just like every other Harder kill. Seconds later, a thunderous blast snapped Matsuo's bow like a toy. Fire erupted across the deck. Sailors were blown into the sea. Steel groaned in agony before folding beneath the waves. The Hayanami hesitated. 1 second, no more. That single heartbeat of fear sealed her fate. Dealey fired one more torpedo, perfectly angled to strike midship. It detonated beneath the keel, sending a column of water and flame skyward. Witnesses described the destroyer splitting in half like a cracked bone. She sank so rapidly that some crew members were pulled under before they could even reach daylight. 5 destroyers, 1 submarine, no surface engagements, no survivors who could explain what hit them. The Imperial Navy's surface warfare doctrine didn't collapse. It bled out. Harder had now done something unprecedented. She had crippled the offensive arm of Japan's fleet without ever fighting a fleet action. Destroyers weren't just ships. They were the eyes, ears, and fists of a navy. Without them, battleships become targets, carriers become liabilities, and convoys become floating coffins. To Japan, Harder became less a submarine and more a supernatural inevitability. Officers whispered her name like a curse. Sailors prayed they would never hear her propellers. Parents back home received telegrams without explanations, because what explanation existed for a ship that disappeared into the ocean without smoke, warning, or honor? Dealey didn't celebrate a single kill. He didn't pose for photos. He didn't revel in headlines. He knew something other men didn't understand. Terror is a weapon, and he had turned it into a manufacturing process. But wars are not stories written for individual heroes. They are tides, and tides change. Harder's rampage had pushed the Imperial Navy to desperation, and desperation breeds traps. The Pacific would soon claim the only prize it could, the hunter himself. But long before the Harder went down, its legacy was already complete, because Japan wasn't losing ships anymore. Japan was losing belief. The USS Harder did not win the Pacific War alone. It didn't fire the biggest guns, launch the heaviest aircraft, or command the largest crews. But what it accomplished shattered the spine of an empire that once believed itself unbeatable. 5 destroyers, elite hunters purpose-built to track and kill submarines, reduced to twisted metal and silent graves by a single American vessel no larger than a city block. That isn't warfare. That's legacy. Commander Samuel D. Dealey and his crew didn't just sink ships, they altered momentum. They proved that precision, discipline, and engineering could outperform arrogance, doctrine, and numbers. Their Mark 18 torpedoes weren't tools, they were signatures. Each detonation stamped a line into history, written not in ink, but in oil, steel, and swallowed seawater. And while Harder eventually met her end, she didn't disappear. Machines die, legends don't. Every modern submarine owes something to the steel nerve of those men sealed inside a pressurized tube, choosing to attack instead of hide, choosing to close distance instead of retreat. Without them, the Pacific might have taken longer, cost more lives, and looked very different. So we remember the Harder. We remember the men who served inside her hull, and we remember the cold, silent truth they delivered. Some heroes don't stand on decks. Some heroes hunt in the dark.